It's the Real Estate Podcast, brought to you by ANZ Home Loans for financial well-beings.
And welcome back to another episode of the Real Estate Breakfast as we do the run-up towards Christmas on another Monday morning. The weekend went way too fast. And it's a Monday, November the 4th today. Now, a few weeks ago, you might remember we were talking about the pessimism about the current housing market hitting its lowest point since early 2023. Some buyers are eager to purchase now before potential rate cuts drive up the competition. The time to buy a dwelling measure, this is a barometer that they sort of gauge to just see where that is sitting. That was up 78 points, though still below the long-term average of 120. Local factors, as we said a few weeks back, such as first home buyer assistance in Queensland and South Australia, have also driven up improvements. So the report that came from Westpac Melbourne Institute Consumer Sentiment Survey. It'll be very interesting to see just what that survey is looking like next year. But right now, time to welcome back Veronica Morgan and getting ever so closer, Veronica, to Christmas.
Oh, it is. I can't believe it.
Yeah, it's definitely on the back doorstep. So how has the buyer sentiment, do you think, just looking and reflecting back on some of those comments with the Westpac Melbourne Institute Consumer Sentiment Survey, how has the buyer sentiment shifted in recent months, do you think, regarding whether it's a good time to purchase a home at the moment?
I love these surveys. I find them really interesting because they do give us a barometer of general market sentiment. This is a big country and we have different property markets operating at the same time, often with different speeds. And it is interesting to think that sentiment has just moved off its all-time low, but it's still under the average, the long-term average. But if you look at Perth, I have to tell you, sentiment over there is very, very high, as in now's the time to buy. Melbourne, however, is quite low. It's a much softer market. So you will see that activity amongst buyers will vary depending on which market's hot or cold at any different time. But certainly anecdotally, and we do talk to a lot of first home buyers at Home Buyer Academy, anecdotally we're hearing that people are thinking, oh, well, if interest rates are going to fall in the new year, then I need to get in now because I want to be able to get in before prices rise. But interestingly enough, I guess their borrowing capacity will go up when interest rates fall along with everybody else's. So there are some people who are thinking, well, I need to wait actually until I've actually got the ability to borrow more money.
Yeah, and just sort of drilling down on the sentiment, of course, from generations, it does change, right? So if you look at the millennials and the Gen Z, etc., those getting into the property market, quite different to us potentially and our parents.
Well, absolutely. I mean, stage of life really creates different needs anyway, and it sort of creates different pressures, and different attitudes, I guess, to the market. And certainly when you're already in it, you're going to feel a lot differently about the property market than you are if you're trying to get into the property market. I think the one thing that we say to a lot of first home buyers in particular who are thinking, I want to time the market, I want to try to work out, okay, when a price is going to rise, I want to get in before that, or when a price is going to fall, I want to wait until that happens. And, it sounds logical to approach the market in that way, but the reality is that none of us have control over the market. And even this sentiment doesn't necessarily reflect what's actually going to happen in the market. Interest rates falling won't necessarily mean immediate rises in prices. And likewise, we've had rising interest rates. In fact, they've been stable now, for the last 10 months or so. But we went through, however many rate rises consecutively. And in that time, yes, there was a period of time when prices fell, but then they rose again. So when you sort of look at the property market and think all these logical things will play out and therefore prices will go up or go down accordingly, it actually doesn't work that way. So the really important thing we say to first home buyers in particular, and really any buyer, is that you need to buy when you are ready to buy, when you have the funds, and when you've found the right property to buy, rather than trying to time an entire market.
Yes, and you've got the Academy there. So, I mean, what is that telling you, the Academy, with your members? Are you seeing the buyers trying to purchase before, as you say, these anticipated rate cuts to avoid the increased competition? I mean, what's the talk around the table on that?
What we're finding in many markets, that the sort of sub $1 million price bracket, the first home buyer bracket in many places, certainly in Sydney, we're finding that that's a really competitive market segment. And so they're not sort of even really focused on, I'm trying to buy now before prices go up further. They're just really focused on trying to get into the market. So it is a very different dynamic. I don't think there's a lot of conversation in our cohort anyway, and maybe it's because they're educated home buyers, but there's not a lot of conversation around trying to beat any future price rises. It's really about getting the right property now and securing it now for a fair price.
All right, we are talking to Veronica Morgan this morning. We'll come back. We'll talk more about just the way people might be viewing property in November.
From powerful and up-to-date news to professional real estate experts with the latest property trends on the Real Estate Podcast.
Investors are driven by capital growth prospects, and we're still expecting markets like Brisbane and Perth, and somewhat in Adelaide as well, to continue to rise. And particularly Perth investors have had their eye on Perth for a while.
I think it's naively, probably not, but I do know friends that are now in that situation and they're still having to live with their ex-partner a year on because they have no other option of getting out of their mortgage and their home they're in.
And unfortunately, 40% started becoming normal for a lot of strata managers, but we just looked at that and said, well, whose interest is it in for such high remuneration models? It's certainly not in the interest of the consumer.
I must admit there is a feeling of liberation and slight freedom in not having to front up to that bank on a regular basis. As you can probably imagine, I make documentaries, so it's pretty unusual to own a home when you're making documentaries.
It's the Real Estate Podcast, talking properties from 6 a.m. every day, from every corner of the Australian real estate market.
And it is a Real Estate Monday, back with Veronica Morgan this morning from the Home Buyer Academy, where you're doing your very best there with trying to be the guiding light for some people that are looking to buy, looking to get educated and finding out as much information, I guess, as much as anything. And that kind of leads me into this question about the state government assistance for first home buyers affecting the local markets, particularly like Queensland and South Australia. No doubt the people on the Academy that might be from those areas very, very keen to understand just how all of that fits together in terms of the money that's being offered.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing with first home buyer grants. They can sometimes hinder and make things more difficult for first home buyers. There's quite a lot of research that has demonstrated ever since they first were, these grants were released, I think back in 2000, they have done nothing but increase property prices. So that is, a bit of an alarming thing. They're put out there supposedly to help first home buyers, but they make the market rise. And certainly when you've got a situation in Queensland and South Australia in particular, Brisbane and Adelaide are two of the three highest performing cities this year in terms of price growth. So therefore, you're assisting people to get into an already inflamed market. So that's I'm not sure whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, to be honest, for the individual. We always coach people in your first home buyer guide to look at these sort of grants as the cherry on top, if you like. You really have to have your strategy right in the first place. You shouldn't be looking at a grab to try to get all the free money from governments, because what they will do, they will put price caps on, and that might suit you. It might be that your budget is less than the price cap anyway. But they also often encourage people to buy a brand new property, and that is very dangerous for first home buyers. And so with those price caps, for example, what we do see is that the cap is $650,000. We see a lot of activity up to that $650,000 mark. And then when there's no grants that are given over that, you see this sort of big value gap that happens, say even $20,000, $50,000 more. You get so much more for your money. So it does distort markets, and it does mean that first home buyers become, extremely competitive segments.
I remember talking with Will up there in Darwin just a few weeks ago. He was telling me they've got the $50,000 for a new build, which is quite meaningful. Now, let's turn our attention to those single income buyers facing affordability challenges. Still challenges in the marketplace. What about these compromises, particularly for these younger people? What are you seeing around compromising when it comes to property choices that they're looking at buying?
Look, everybody has to make compromises. Even if you've got, huge income and a huge amount of money, there's always compromises. So I guess I would encourage people to make friends with the word compromise. The compromise that people are often making is that they just they'll get to the point where they've got 5% plus cost. If they can avoid stamp duty by getting various benefits there, they'll do that. And then they'll just get into the market as soon as they can at the cheapest and smallest property that they can to get into the market. And for some people that works, and that's a good thing to do because they can't outsave the market. But for other people, they're buying in a property that they'll outgrow in 5 minutes, and by outgrowing it, they can sometimes get trapped on the first rung of the ladder where they're never actually able to upgrade to the point where they get a property where it's large enough for their needs, or they can upgrade at some point, but then they do blow all those transaction costs in the process. It's a challenge to get into the market, but I think I'd always caution people to be just very mindful about what you get in with. All property is not good. You need to be focusing on a property that's going to actually do its job and heavy lift you up that property ladder as your needs grow as you get older.
All properties are not good. That's right. And I remember at the start of the year, we were talking about that kitchlet that was reported on in Sydney. I forget how big it was. It was just a shoebox size. What do you do when, somebody comes to you and says, Veronica, look at this. I can get into my first property. It's only 25 square metres.
Sometimes what we do is sit down and show them case studies of how these properties underperform over time, and the gap between where they're at now and where they need to be gets wider and wider. And I think that that's the scary thing for buyers. There's this rhetoric around that you just got to get in. It doesn't matter what you get, just get on the ladder. But, if you do buy the wrong property and if you do buy something that's got a very small resale pool, then that can cost you a huge amount of money over time.
I mean, this wasn't a thing when I bought my first property. I mean, I remember distinctively 1,500 square metres. I bought the 3-bedroom property, subdivided. I think I only paid about $45,000 for the property, subdivided, got $18,000 for the land. And it didn't occur to me, I'd be having this conversation in 2024. Ignorance was bliss back then because these little kitchlets and so forth just wasn't around. It wasn't part of the market.
Well, weirdly enough, my first property was a 36 square metre studio.
Right.
So I can, a long time ago now, and I can speak to that. This was before the 50 square metre rule sort of came in with a lot of banks. I was able to borrow, his money was free, obviously, or freely available. I was able to borrow 95% of it. This is a long time ago. But in the time that I literally outgrew it in a year. So then I moved out and rented it out. And then 5 years later, I needed to buy a bigger home. And by that time, I'd coupled up. And I couldn't keep this property because the banks had all changed their policy and were no longer lending readily for properties under 50 square metres. So when I couldn't keep it, even though I could afford to keep it in the sense that the rent was actually paying the mortgage. But the bank's policy changed, so therefore I was forced to sell it, and there were not many buyers around. Now, yes, I did make a small, modest profit, but that was luck more than good design. And if I think back to when I did buy that property, I never even looked at other options.
Yeah.
It felt safe to me because it was cheap.
Yeah.
And that's where I made my big mistake.
Yeah, well, I remember the bank because I was 19. They didn't even want to loan me the money, but they had to because I ticked every box.
Well done on that, by the way. But, again, luck from the sounds of it.
I think the worst part of this podcast is people are going to be saying, Craig, how old are you exactly buying a property with $45,000?
I was thinking that myself. But, you did say you started at 19.
Yeah, it was a different marketplace and a different human back then, that is for sure. Hey, great to chat with you this morning, Veronica. Enjoy your Monday and the wind-up, of course, into next month and finishing off the year.
Yeah, likewise for you. And if I don't see you before the end of the year, happy Christmas and happy New Year.
Likewise, yeah.
We connect you to the best real estate information across Australia. The Real Estate Podcast.